Welcome back to another episode of Hungry for the Word Pod. Um, Today we're going to be talking about the bread of life, which of course Jesus calls himself, but there are several references and allusions to this throughout the Old Testament and the prophets that Jesus is both referring to and fulfilling with his life and time here. So we'll get into that a little bit. What do you say?
Sounds great.
Do you want to start us off with the bread of life uh, verse that we'll be sort of using as a reference?
Oh, sure. It's all over, but I picked John 6 talks about that quite a bit. So 6:35, Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Whoever
Mm.
comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst.
Mm, that's a good promise.
Yeah.
Um, and I think what the effort is to do today when talking about the bread of life is to just differentiate a little bit between sort of the 30 and 60 fold approach, which again is not incorrect, but just limits the fullness of God's glory from being able to show up in your life, and what more 100-fold approach to that bread of life might start to look like. Um, and so when I think about the bread of life, I think kind of about the consumerism culture that we live in, especially in the West. I mean, it feels like most of the developed world is pretty consumer driven. And what I mean by consumerism is almost like a Mad Men, if anyone's seen that show, approach to advertisements and living. It's that they've created this narrative that you're not complete until you get this thing. Come buy this, and then you'll have everything you need after that. And, having lived in several generations deep of that being the way that we've been communicated to, I think in a lot of ways, uh, we unknowingly do a sort of consumerism Christianity. And so what I mean by that is the approach to specifically the bread of life from a consumer standpoint is I'm broken. I'm a broken human. I'm needing help. I'm needing saved. I'm full of my sin. I can't get out of my own way, and I need Jesus. And don't get me wrong, there's truth in
That's
that,
true.
right? Especially you and I have literally stood in that place and known that to be true about ourselves. And so I'm not refuting that that's true. What I'm saying is that is a 30-fold response to the goodness of God. Is that is how good he is, that he would provide the answer to you. When you are broken and when you are sinning, Jesus is the only answer. And sometimes in that moment, it really just looks like having some type of comfort. You know what I mean? It doesn't mean the situation changes. It doesn't mean your behavior changes. It looks like some glimmer of hope, some smidgen of comfort sort of works its way into your heart and life. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And then a 60-fold approach, perhaps, to the bread of life would be to think uh, he is what's giving my life mortal, or sorry, giving my mortal body life. It is that he sustains me. It's sort of the approach to my grace is sufficient. Through the Lord, I'm sustained in all things. And I've seen people, we've even, in fact, might have even talked about it on the podcast, people who are able to live off of communion have this sort of response to the bread of life. They're able to literally be sustained by the bread of life that Jesus has given. Just by consuming communion, they're able to sustain themselves for days, if not weeks on end. And again, also true and also amazing.
Yeah.
Both of these responses are great responses. Um, but a 100-fold response to the bread of life, in my opinion, is coming to us from Ezekiel 39. So a little bit of context in 38 and 39, uh, in this vision that Isaiah is having, Israel is invaded by Gog and Magog, which is a prince of this evil land, and Gog literally translates to the mountain. It's this land of wickedness, sin, and evil. And so evil, sin has invaded Israel, and Israel is able to come out victorious because of the Lord, because of what he's done. And so in beginning in 17, God says to them, "As for you, mortal, thus says the Lord God, speak to the birds of every kind and to all the wild animals, assemble and come, gather from all around to the sacrificial feast that I am preparing for you, a great sacrificial feast on the mountains of Israel, and you shall eat flesh and drink blood." And I think that is specifically when Jesus first in his ministry sort of drew a line in the sand and sent a handful of followers away. He said to them, "Eat my flesh and drink my blood." And they were offended by that because they're coming from a physical consumerism attachment to the earth standpoint where they're thinking he literally means to eat his body. But he's talking about this sacrificial feast that the Lord is prepared so that all can come to the wedding. No matter if you were on the original invite list or not, this great feast where he says, "Speak to the birds of every kind, all the wild animals, everywhere on earth, assemble and come, gather from all around for the sacrificial feast that I'm preparing for you." And so to me, the 100-fold response is to recognize that he has prepared this feast in past tense. You are now the being who's at the feast. And so
Mm,
rather than this outside in needing of Jesus to still complete you, and again, to be able to live off of communion alone and to need that, but get that need met, that is an amazing thing. I think, again, I'm not going to
mhm,
say
mhm,
we should all strive for it, but that's brilliant when that happens. And yet, an even higher truth is available where you are the being that is at this feast for all time. You're at the wedding already. Everything has been prepared for you. You get to now enjoy the fruits of being at that feast, not participating to get to that feast one day. Does that make sense?
mm. Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
that's good.
What do you think?
Well, I just am thinking you're reading Ezekiel, and that's the Old Testament, and then you said uh, this is already done in the past. So as you read the word, as you are hungry for the word, and you read it all through the Old Testament, you see Jesus and the
Mm,
answer that this is another example. Uh, he's the answer. The feast
hmm.
is in front of you. It's already done, and just learn to step in and live from that place.
Totally. Well, I'm you saying it like that reminds me of Psalm 23. Like
Hmm.
when David says, "You prepare a feast before me in the presence of my enemies." I mean, this is they've just invaded and you're
Yeah,
preparing a feast. That's what we're talking about. You know
yeah.
what I mean? Um, but yeah, to
Well,
that
and
point, go ahead. Sorry.
well, I was just going to say, to the point of today, it's we're living in a time where we're kind of waking up to some enemies that have maybe enslaved us and
Hmm.
not been acting as righteous as we potentially thought.
Right.
But remember this, he is and will prepare a feast for us at this
Hmm.
time
Hmm.
already as well.
Exactly.
So
It's
we don't have to worry about, oh, what are we going to do? Well, let's go to the feast.
yeah, exactly. Well, and it's funny because again, it's that quantum entanglement of it's already happened, it's happening, it will happen.
Mhm.
It's only our linear perception of time that makes us think that this is still to come in the future when there's truth to that on
Mhm.
this level, but on the realm, or rather in the realm where God sits, the feast is prepared. And again, it's funny. It's sort of a semi transition. I had another verse that I had pulled up that really talks about, I'll say, what Jesus has done mixed with what he continues to do. Like while the earth does not yet look like heaven, I can't remember who it is in one, if not several of the letters, when they refer to Jesus, they call him a mediator, an advocate for
Mm,
all time on
mhm.
our behalf, that he's already paid the eternal wages of sin with his body, but that he also like actively sits in heaven and is our lawyer. We go out and we make a mistake, and it's funny, the um I was telling you about that sort of joke that I heard last week what said, uh if you don't sin, Jesus died for nothing.
Mm,
And like I said, of course, I'm not advocating go do wickedness, but wickedness is against our nature, anyways. You don't want
mhm.
to go do wickedness. It's the recognition that you thinking living a mistake free life is what gets you to the table totally rejects the fact that he is actively your lawyer in heaven right now. Every time you make any mistake of any sort,
Mhm.
he's, I got you. I'm arguing on your behalf. We see the best in you. You know what I mean?
And oftentimes when we talk about sin or what he died for, we are hyper focused on the bad stuff. But remember, we define
Right.
sin as falling short of his glory.
Hmm.
So we want to remember that he will help us get to manifesting his glory.
Right.
I mean,
And,
because
and
we're not, like you said, running around doing all these quote bad things.
exactly.
Yeah.
And saying the same thing in slightly different words, I like to think of sin as reaching with your own hand for what he's already given you. And it's that concept
Yes.
of you've been made this being, and sin is just befuddling it because it doesn't naturally flow out. So you try to make it. You try to get
Mm.
something and do something to get it. And anyways, so
Yeah, but back to the verse.
to the verse, and I'll take another sip beforehand. Sorry. So this is Job, and beginning in 32, 33, 34, um, Elihu, which is he is our God. That's what his name translates to, or whose God is he? And he's rebuking Job before the Lord comes in and rebukes Job. So kind of laying some of the foundation of what the Lord needs to communicate. And he's just talking in general about humans and how we get in our own way and we cause all this death and strife, and we have pain in our body and we have wickedness in our hearts, not speaking that over us, saying that it happens. And when we find ourselves there, what do we do? And so I thought of the verse because we're talking about the bread of life. And he says, starting in 19, uh, they have pain while they lay on their beds, they have continual strife in their bones. Their lives loathe bread, and their appetites dainty food. Their flesh is so wasted away that it cannot be seen. Their souls draw near to the pit, and their lives to those who bring death. But then, and this is where enters our man Jesus, and then, if there should be for one of them an angel, a mediator, one of 1,000, one who declares a person upright, and he is gracious to that person and says, deliver him from going down into the pit. I have found a ransom. Let his flesh be fresh with youth, and let him return to the days of his youthful vigor. Let him pray to God and then be accepted by him. So he comes into his presence with joy, and God repays him for his righteousness. that person will sing to others and say, I sinned and perverted what was right, and it was not paid back to me. He has redeemed my soul from going down to the pit, and my life shall see the light. God indeed does these things twice, three times with mortals to bring their souls back from the pit so that they might see the light of life. And I
Mm,
know that's a run on, but again, it all describes him, and it describes God's character, which is the context that it's in his nature to do that for you. And Elihu's talking at a time where Jesus hasn't come yet. So to say that even before Jesus, God would do this for mortals twice, three times even, and now for all time, we have an advocate on our behalf that you are seated at this wedding feast as a life-giving spirit because for all time he has declared you upright and has found a ransom. And I just think
mhm,
that's an insane response to the indication that he's the bread of life. That's the 100-fold truly living in how can you do my works and greater by accepting what I've done, seeing yourself at the feast, and now be a family member. You're a
mm.
citizen with the saints, you know?
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, because I think because historically, as we've, moved as people, I'm sure a lot of people have gotten this in the past, but if we are moving as a body of Christ through generations of,
Hmm.
revelation that we've seen, um, I just think it's very exciting to be at
Mm.
that generation that starts that's the starting place, right?
I
I mean,
agree.
yes, we're not taking away the fact that there is a crucifixion and that we are born again and
Hmm.
all that still takes place,
Right.
but we don't get stuck there. Now we get to learn how to live as sons of God that are at a feast and start doing the ruling and reigning that he'd like to see his sons do on earth today.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And it's funny when you were kind of saying the things, I actually thought you were going to talk about we're not refuting what's going on in the world. I think that's
Oh
kind of the
yeah.
point. Like what's going on in the world is probably pretty similar to what the Hebrews were feeling at the time that Jesus came. They've been oppressed for hundreds of years. They don't really know God anymore. And yet, where we're different is Jesus has already come. And
Mm,
that's what you're talking about is the yes, look around, it looks like this, but how exciting to be at a time where we are waking up to our responsibility. And so, all through the body of Christ, we're taking more and more. Again, I'll say responsibility. I don't necessarily mean just in the way of works responsibility,
yeah.
but like an internal responsibility for, to your point, living in this truth internally before it ever manifests in the physical, that we are able to accept the fullness of this gift, not limit it to and again that's where I wanted to tread lightly as we talk about the 30 and 60 fold responses. Those are great responses. And so don't judge someone if that's their current response to Jesus. Is we've all lived in seasons where we were broken and you need him most when your brokenness is presenting itself the most. And so that is a good response if you have no other response. But to live there full time significantly limits your ability to walk the earth as a son of God and do what Jesus did and greater if you don't accept the fullness of what this gift really means. And as we've talked about before, my biggest struggle with this has been the self-condemnation. and the disqualifying
Mm,
of myself from saying, seeing some of my brokenness, seeing some of my weakness. And in those moments, I, it feels like blasphemy to me to say that it's no longer I that live, it's Christ, that this is God as one with me. You know what I mean? This is not my resurrected self. And it's almost ironic that in those moments are the invitation to recognize that this is a gift that comes well beyond your ability, and being renewed by the acceptance of the gift is part of the healing of the gift. It's you no longer coming before God and insisting on looking at your brokenness means that you can finally start to hear what he's spoken over you about your completeness, and in trusting you so completely, like he has so much faith in you to become the thing that he knows that you already are, that he's letting you walk it out at whatever pace you walk it out. He is
mm,
so confident that what he's spoken is not only already true, but it is inevitable in terms of his will to become, that he just sees over you that you already are this thing. And what delays that gift the longest is you insisting it's not already true, you disqualifying self and choosing to trust your own perception of yourself instead of
mhm,
trusting the one who's made you, or should I say, remade you.
mm.
That doesn't get you going. What does?
Yeah,
You
exactly.
know?
Well, and I love think of how what bread it has provided in civilization. It's just
Mm.
I mean, we have a baker in our family, so we might
Uh-huh.
know a little bit more about bread than others,
We
but
might have a little more joy than the average
but
bread eater.
it's been, I mean, around since man's been around,
Hmm.
and I think I love that idea of sustenance
Yes.
also. We've talked a lot about, um, I don't know, but when Jesus says, I am your sustenance, I
Yes.
just
Well, and
love that.
and you're bringing us sort of back to um, a good bringing it all together point, which
Mhm,
is the beauty of the 100-fold is that everything beneath you is also true. So when you live in the 60, you also have the 30-fold. And so to your point, the word is true on every layer. And
mhm,
as a son of God, you get access to all of them. And I think that's part of what Jesus means by the whole kingdom is your inheritance. And now you lay hold of it. You have tutors and governors to come up into your inheritance, that I've given you this thing that it still remains true that you're sustained through me. I mean, again, if we want to talk on a quantum level, that all food is just energy in a particular matter form. And if
mhm.
all of energy is Yahweh himself, then literally the word sustains you. Every time you eat, you're eating word. And it's also true that in those moments, no matter how long you've been walking with God, that you might feel a brokenness, that in those moments you are encouraged to, you must lean on what Jesus has done, lean on the Father. Those things don't stop becoming true just because you're able to live in an even higher return on the same seed going in. Does that make sense?
Mm. Yeah, yeah,
Um, so we're kind of coming close to time here. I'll, in the effort of sort of wrapping us up, we don't need to have a single thought, but what's bubbling up for you as far as the bread of life, what we've talked about today, and not living as a strictly as a consumer of it.
yeah. Um, well, the idea that being at the feast, there's also a lot of other people at the feast. So this is not only, it doesn't stop with us being full and, oh, I'm satisfied, so good
Mm-hmm.
on me, but we're at a feast and it can be shared with everyone. So I was just kind of pondering that, is that,
Mm-hmm.
as we've talked before, Jesus is in me. And if Jesus is the bread of life, that means I'm the bread of life. So
Mm,
in different situations, I can also be that,
totally.
sharing the feast, if you will.
Yeah, that's funny. Um your first thought, I wasn't sure if you were looking at my notes. It's when I was in college, our coach told us this parable. It's I guess an ancient Chinese belief about heaven and hell, and it says that they're the same setting. It's this giant 1,000-mile long dinner table, and everyone has 12-foot chopsticks. And in hell, everyone's trying to feed themselves. And in
Ah,
heaven, everyone's feeding everyone else. And so they look down and their plate is full. And I think about that as far as when I think of the bread of life, and your last comment that he's in us, part of the gift of Jesus and part of what we've been talking about in our last couple episodes as far as forgiveness and the resurrection without exception is when you withhold the free bread that was given to you from the next person in line because they don't deserve it, that is actually you've withheld it from yourself in some way because
mhm,
we're all at this table. We're all sharing the feast of the firstborn, the feast of the lamb, the wedding feast, this great sacrificial feast. We're all celebrating that, to your point. And to deny someone else a bite, to deny someone else free food, if you will, is to deny it from yourself, but to not have really accepted it, because
mhm,
then you would know that this is something that you can only do for yourself, or you cannot do for yourself. And so when Jesus does it for you, like this guy says, the sinner turns around and sings, I sinned and perverted what was right, and it was not paid back to me. He has redeemed me from going to the pit, and my life shall see the light. And so,
mhm,
um, kind of segueing into what's bubbling up for me as we talk about it is again the so many different layers of what Jesus's words meant, and being able to read in the word, and in the same way that at 100-fold everything beneath you is also yours. It's this concept of no matter where you're at in terms of living in the fruit of that righteousness in your life, or even aware of some promises, that coming to Jesus in terms of when we talked about the model prayer, give us this day our daily bread. It's this
mhm,
notion that even before you're aware that you need sustenance in that direction, so to speak, he's providing for you. It's like with the Israelites, you wake up and the manna's already there. And I think about his
mhm,
nature and living in the gratitude that not only did he send his son to be the bread of life, but that even in your unawareness of him providing for you and sustaining you, that that's exactly what he is doing. And
mhm,
I like that Jesus in the model prayer wanted to acknowledge that. But if you'll notice in that prayer, Jesus doesn't necessarily say thank you for it. He says, give us this day. And the recognition that that's not a command, it is intimacy and relationship. Your child asking you for a cup of water. They don't beg and you don't withhold. It's that giving is receiving mentality. And
mhm,
again, he's the bread of life, and he means everything we've talked about in this episode and what we haven't covered, you know?
Yeah. As you were
Mm.
talking about the manna, just real quick, they were warned against the consumerism of collecting that manna, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so that kind of wraps it up nice what you were talking about, right? You don't, it's not a one and done. I'm going to be here every day given daily stuff. You
Hmm.
don't need to consume it and get it and hold it on,
Well,
it's a
and
daily walk.
your specific instruction, I think that we're kind of getting to is when he
Oh,
says the on Saturday on the Sabbath,
oh,
only gather enough or that's the only time you gather enough for
for
two
two
days.
days. Yeah.
Every other time, I'll give it to you that day. And so when they did gather extra, they woke up the next morning and it was worms. And
Yeah.
it's that point of, again, when we talk about sin, sin is reaching with your own hand for something he wants to give you freely. You're not trusting his nature of providing that for you every day. And so you think that it's a reflection on yourself that you're saying, oh, I'm just taking care of me to grab this. When in reality, you're rejecting his nature. You're rejecting the gift he wants to give you by not accepting the invite to the wedding feast. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, that's good.
That's good.
Yeah,
Well, good thought. Um, I suppose that's a good place to wrap it up. What do you think?
I think that's good.
Perfect. Well, we'll see you guys
Okay.
next episode. Bye.
Okay, bye.